before I go in and give a spiel about like what we do, what I do, and stuff like that, I just wanted to know like where does ReptiFiles stand with supportive conservation groups, and if you are like supporting them, um, I guess who would it be, or like what has your experience been with conservation groups?
Hmm. So conservation's not my forte. It's I try to stay more or less abreast of things, but ultimately it's just something on the fringe. Um, I've attended one of the annual powwows for the Abronia Alliance. That's where I got that. It was a lot of fun. Um, and I follow a couple more that I can't think of. The Turtle and Tortoise Survival Alliance, I
Okay,
think it's
DJ's on
called.
that. Yeah.
And then a couple of others. But oh, drat! I'm wearing their shirt. The Orion Society.
And Sing Orient Society, that's a good one.
Yeah, yeah. Um, so yeah, there's a few. I definitely ReptiFiles is all for conservation, but there's also when it comes to there's this friction, right, between the pet trade and conservation. And that is conservation groups say no importation whatsoever from the wild. And the pet trade needs importation from the wild. Um, Not because we can't sustain it, we can breed our own animals for sure, but we need the genetic diversity that wild caught animals bring. And so you see issues where we are losing genetic diversity with Australian species is a really great example. Australian species, particularly the ones that have been bred for a long time in the US, we're seeing that with bearded dragons
Trying
because we
so
can
hard to
get
find
fresh wild stock. They're actually ball pythons are another good example of this.
Mhm.
But
And leopard geckos.
yeah, they're so
Mhm.
far removed from their wild counterparts that you have to start taking into account that they might be a different subspecies altogether. You've got the wild type and you've got the uh, basically domesticated version, which is a different animal. If we're talking, we have morphs instead of breeds in the reptile hobby, but I would call if we were to have breeds, there would be the wild breed of bearded dragons and then the domestic breed.
It's like the Bactrian camels.
Yeah, there you go.
Mhm.
Um, it's they are different. Very much in the way that they look, and also they tend to be more screwed up on the inside, which means they have less potential to live to the full lifespan because of it. It's a little hard to untangle there because a lot of it is the way that they're kept, rather than their innate biology based on the genetics that have snowballed over generations of captive breeding. But like ball pythons, I see this a lot actually, and leopard ball pythons and leopard geckos in particular, because you can get those wild caught still. Not often, but you can. Um, Ball pythons that are wild caught, and you hear anecdotes from people who have a ball python that was wild caught. These animals are living ridiculously long lifespans. I mean, hitting 50 years.
Wow.
The ball pythons that are being uh, bred right now, the morphs, and even like a normal morph ball python being bred right now is not the same animal. It's very unlikely to have that same lifespan because it doesn't have the genetics that were filtered by nature for, figuring out what does this animal need to survive periods of drought, periods of famine? Like, how do we make a really hardy animal? And that's what nature does best. So you see these animals that are very resilient, uh, even though wild caught animals have this reputation for being fragile, they're actually the most resilient that we have in the pet trade. Um, Man, I can't say anything without being like asterisk there. We could go like there
When
are exceptions.
properly acclimated and treated and not stressed. And
Right. And there are, because of how easily they stress, some species actually even though they're healthier in the wild than like a multi-generational bred version in captivity, the ones that are bred in captivity are healthier because they are not stressed. And so that's a factor. That's basically the short way of putting it. But the same thing with leopard geckos. The really old leopard geckos that you're seeing, one, they're getting they get to hibernate every year. That does a big it's a big benefit to their to them physiologically when they get to hibernate because they get to rest. But yeah, the ones that are closer to their that are not as morphy, the ones that are closer to the wild root, the wild type of animal, those are the ones that are living the longest and they have the fewest health problems over the course of their life.
I haven't
So
actually looked into if there's any kind of papers on the skeletal structure between them, but I think I've noticed kind of what you're talking about with the White's tree frogs. If you look at pictures of the wild individuals versus ones that have been in captivity for generations on generations, you see differences in the body
yes.
shape and proportions and the jaws and stuff like that.
And that's what we humans do. We breed for appearance. That's
Yeah.
something we've done with horses. That's something we've done with cows, with dogs and pigs and everything else that we can get our hands on. When we get our hands on a species and start breeding it in captivity, the way it looks changes to whatever pleases us best. So captive bearded dragons look a lot cuter than their wild counterparts. They're overall softer and more cuddly looking than the lean, dried out things that you see in Australia. And you can see that there's a very American look. That the American bearded dragon looks very different from the Australian bearded dragon, and the American leopard gecko looks very different from the wild leopard gecko. Not quite as different, but their skeletal structure is not quite as altered, but it's still there. But bringing it back to conservation, so yeah, that's the friction between the pet trade and conservation. But it's my biggest stance on conservation is that we need more small batch breeders. We need more people who are specializing in the animals that are being taken from the wild. Because one, if you're taking an animal that we are continuously taking out of the wild because we don't know how to breed it in captivity, that means we don't know how to care for it in captivity. Breeding is the bare minimum in most cases. If you can't get the animal to survive well enough to be able to reproduce, we don't know how to get the animal to thrive. So that's baseline, just establishing a baseline. And the way to refine our understanding of reptile husbandry is to have more small batch breeders becoming experts in one or two unique species. Like Europlatus used to be that way. So those leaf-tailed geckos, we weren't breeding them very well, and so there's a very small domestic population. So we didn't really know how to care for them very well. And they were considered sensitive because of that. Mexican arboreal alligator lizards, man, say that 5 times fast. Abronia are also, being able to breed those in captivity successfully is a big project. It takes pressure off of wild populations, especially when these species are being illegally collected. If you can, I'm not even talking about like conserving the ones that are being legally collected, because usually the ones that are legally collected, it's not as much of a strain on the wild population because there are limits in place and the people who collect and sell them have a motivation to keep viable populations around nearby so that they can continue. So they farm them, essentially, is what it becomes, for better or for worse. But
That
it's the illegal collection that is the biggest problem. And small batch breeding, creating the invisible arc, creating availability within the states of these healthy animals that are not being illegally imported in people's, suitcases, so they're going to arrive in terrible condition. That takes pressure off populations, because it reduces demand for them.
definitely. Now, I wanted to just briefly, before we get into the last question, I wanted to also say one of the cool things that we've been doing. So I'm the president and founder of the nonprofit PA Woods and Forests. We do a lot of native work with amphibians mostly, and we're starting to get into a pollinator department now. And we've been doing some really cool stuff. One of the things that we've started to do is filming these animals as I go out and like look for them and document them and different things. So it's on YouTube this year, and it really was introduced last year, but I'm trying to apply the educator permit, which allows me to rescue and take in these frogs and toads, to display that for people and to bring that into the conservation project, because ambassador animals are such a massive gain whenever you're trying to tell the story about trying to keep an animal alive, whether it be abundant or, you know, at risk or whatever. So that's one of the big projects that I head up every year. I start from February to basically July, and then it comes out in August. But I just wanted to share that with you because we're kind of different, I guess, from what you've experienced, because we're like that middle ground where we have people like Amelia who can come on here and talk, and others as well. Like, you know, I work really closely with Josh's frogs, but at the end of the day as well, like I'm starting to work with the Pittsburgh Zoo to do surveys and start doing like hardcore conservation projects. So we have a good mix of both things. And I just wanted to kind of bring that up because that's a big part of like what we talk about. Like we're going to have a whole episode at the end of the year, our year, on this podcast. I just wanted to kind of throw that out there too, in case you had any interest in talking about it down the road too. But those are I think things now that are starting to become more popular, as we're starting to see, like, I don't know, maybe
Citizen
it's
science.
I think that we're starting to see like a grassroots movement of people that want to be in both. You know, you think of a lot of the big YouTubers and it's from the
Mhm.
pet side, but you think a lot of the people who move the needle for animals and it's the wildlife, like the conservation people. So I think we kind of fit in that box where we're kind of a balance of both. And I don't know that that's popular or trending right now, but I do think that that's an up and coming thing that I see. And I was curious to hear, I guess, what your thoughts are on like kind of that, finding that mix.
Yeah, that's the funny thing about keeping exotics, isn't it? Is, you know, you have a domesticated animal as a pet, or even most mammals, really. Like you don't get a pet hamster because you saw a documentary about them and you want a piece of nature to take home. Like, no, you think about getting a pet hamster and you think about putting it in a little plastic cage with, you know, a wheel and feeding it a seed mix and keeping it on rainbow colored paper bedding. For better or for worse, that's what most people think of when they think of a hamster. They don't think about wolves when they get dogs, usually. They don't think about lions when they get cats. You don't think about like a zebra or a Przewalski's horse when you get a horse. They're just domesticated animals. A horse is a horse, a dog is a dog. When you get a pet lizard or a pet snake, it's often because you saw a snake when you were out on a hike. It's because you saw a documentary about a lizard. It's because you saw a tortoise at the zoo or a turtle at the aquarium, and you go, wow, that is a cool animal. I want to have a piece of nature in my home. I want this feeling of awe with me always. And that's kind of what spurs the interest in keeping an exotic animal. It's very different. And there's less of, it's emotional, but in a different way. You're looking to connect with an animal that is very likely not to care much about your existence. Not on the same level. Like, you do see cases of reptiles that bond strongly with their keepers, but for the most part, it's a very different experience. And the nature of it all is what brings us together, is that love for where they came from and that respect for all that they are and what nature has made them. And that's what we have in common with conservationists, and why it's so important not to lose touch with conservation. Because if we lose touch with where these animals came from, then, and that's a big part of my my research as a natural history based husbandry specialist, is if we lose track of where they came from, lose sight of that, just kind of forget about what shaped them, then we lose track of what they are in essence. And it all goes downhill from there. You see that, and we're seeing it even now, ball pythons. People get the wrong idea about their natural history, what they're actually like in the wild, and they start drawing these crazy conclusions. They're like, based on my experiences, or based on this one picture I saw, obviously these snakes never climb. Obviously, these snakes are never active during the day. Obviously, they don't bask. Obviously, they stay in a hole all the time. And that's not true. Because most people, we don't give our animals the options to tell us the whole story. And usually we only have experience, those of us who give the animals options to tell us more about them don't have enough of the animals to give us a good sample of what they're capable of. So that's where we need to stay in touch with the conservation side, is so that we don't lose their history and their foundation.